Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. This episode is with Nick Enfield. He's a professor of linguistics at the University of Sydney. Nick's research on language, culture, cognition, and social life is based on long-term fieldwork in mainland Southeast Asia, especially Laos. His books include Natural Causes of Language, Distributed Agency, and How We Talk. His latest book is Language versus Reality: Why Language is Good for Lawyers and Bad for Scientists. In this conversation, we talk about evolution of language and how well it can describe reality. Can language nudge our thoughts? Maths as a language? Evolution of human reason and rationality. Enjoy the conversation, share and subscribe to support the podcast. Thank you for listening. Hi, Nick. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so thinking about language, which is such an important tool for humanity, let's get into the semantics of language itself. So what is language? How do we define it?
Well, that's a tough question. Language is hard to define in a bunch of ways because there are so many uses of the word. You know, people talk about different languages. They mean, Japanese or Hindi or English. And also people talk about, the language of bees or, body language. And they use all of these terms that are not the same as what it means to say that English is a language. And so the normal use of the word mixes up something very specific, that is the system that humans use to communicate, with some sort of general idea of any communicative system. But I think what you're asking is what defines human language. And I think that there are what Charles Hockett once called unique design features of language, and they include things like the possibility to make reference, the possibility to displace reference, so that is to refer to things that are at a different place and time. So other animal communication systems can refer to things right here, right now, but they don't. They're not able to refer to what happened yesterday or what would happen tomorrow. So those are a couple of the example features that would help to understand what's unique about language. Another unique feature of language is that language can be used to refer to itself. So you can use the communicative system to talk about the communicative system, and you can ask things like, what did you mean? Or, what did he say? You can quote other people's speech. And these features really generate this incredible power to language that animal communication systems don't have, or at least if they have any trace of that, it's very rudimentary. So those would be some of the features of language. The problem then is to look at human language and ask what is not counted in that. So, if I'm using my hands and doing gestures, or if I have facial expressions that are part of my message, there's an open question as to how I treat them with respect to language. So those are actually open questions. So some people argue that hand gestures are part of language, but exactly what that means is kind of an interesting question. So that would be just a few elements of what I would say in answer to your question.
Yeah, but so one thing that you mentioned is this animal communication system. So language is a communication system, and especially in biology, when we are thinking about anything, most of the times we are thinking that phenomena in terms of evolution. And when it comes to communication, of course, communication we can find in other species. Even now, like at the bacteria level, so really at the single cellular level, we can find communication systems. So the question is, when does a communication system becomes a language?
Yeah, it's an important point, I think, that you're making, that if you talk about language, you have to acknowledge that it is an animal communication system, and it is founded on a kind of an infrastructure that comes with our biology, and so my view is in line with sort of there's a famous paper in the biology of animal vocal communication by Krebs and Dawkins from the early 80s, and they talk about how any communication system in animals is a system for manipulating or influencing the behavior of another agent. And I think that is sort of the most powerful underlying kind of insight around what is biologically basic about language. So it is a device ultimately for influencing the thought patterns, influencing the behavior of other individuals who we are associated with. And the question then becomes, well, what's the mechanism of that influence and what is the kind of goal of that influence? And you can see in animal communication systems that the mechanism and the goal, to a large extent, are pretty basic, because you're often talking about things like predator-prey relations, and you're trying to manipulate, you're trying to change the behavior of an organism based on deception, or maybe you are manipulating behavior of another organism in a courtship context. And so, oftentimes there are these very sort of easy to understand kind of biological motivations for influence between one agent and another. And I think what's really special about language is that it includes all of those basic principles, but it adds on top of it something very unique, and that is that it is a very, very cooperative kind of system, much more cooperative than other systems. And that's because it's grounded in social norms, and it requires a sort of joint commitment to social norms around how we use language. So maybe we'll get into this, I'm not sure, but the current thinking about the evolution of language in our species is paying a lot of attention to not just our cognition around kind of manipulating information in complex ways, but around social cognition at a high level. So the extent to which we can imagine other people's mental states, the extent to which we can make joint commitments to norms that are shared within a community. So evolutionary speaking, those things I just mentioned that have to do with sort of higher order social cognition, they're very new in language as a biologically evolved capacity, if you like.
This is very interesting. So what you are referring here is that once we narrow down human languages to a communication system, basically there are two effects that we see. One is the first one is that we can affect the other person or the other individual, and the second is the coordination part. And it seems like these two are important phenomena, which also you talk a lot about in your book, Language versus Reality. And the second thing that you mentioned is the higher order phenomena that we see in, especially in the case of humans, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, let's talk about the second part first. How did then language got started? Do we have any inclination there?
Well, it's famously something that many linguists have been warned not to talk about. It's very hard to speculate about the real evolution of the original events that led to the evolution of language, simply because those kinds of things don't fossilize easily. But there is brilliant research going on, especially in the last 20 years or so, in the field of the evolution of language, and you have this incredible kind of comparative research, modeling, experimental research, or testing all sorts of hypotheses around how language must have evolved. I think one of the things you would need to emphasize is that language really is a complex adaptive system that is not just this one kind of encapsulated type of behavior. So, it's very much emergent from many different factors. So in order to understand how language evolves, you have to think about a whole range of different factors that come into play to allow it to emerge. So you have certain cognitive capacities for processing information, things like memory, speed of your capacity to process information of a certain kind, and to combine bits of information in certain kinds of ways. So there's a whole lot of presupposition around psychological capacities there. But on top of that, you have to also have very particular population dynamics. So you have social network dynamics that allow language to circulate within a community. So one of the most important things to realize about language is that the actual surface properties of language are specific to certain populations and to certain periods of time. So it's not like many animal species where, the actual signals are roughly, innate, or they're roughly kind of pre-programmed in some sense. So there's a sort of a set inventory of, a few signals, or maybe a few dozen signals, or even 100 or more. But with language, we have today some 7,000 different languages spoken on the planet. And in each of those, you have tens of thousands of completely different words. And then you have hundreds or maybe thousands of productive grammatical constructions. So those things do not come from the brain. Those things come from historical processes of evolution on the cultural level, right? So there's something very crucial about understanding the evolution of language, is that when we actually study language and we look at the structures of any individual language, like Japanese or English, or or whatever the language might be, you're studying a historically developed structure. You're not studying a biologically evolved structure. So that sort of sets the coordinates a little bit for thinking about the original evolution of language, and that is that you had to have certain psychological but also certain social conditions in place before language could emerge, right? So you had to have people, for example, sharing attention, people creating social realities through arbitrary agreements, people having norms, people sort of policing those norms, certain social contexts. And then within that context, you then begin to get conventions, arbitrary conventions evolving. And then, the rest is history, as they say. But it's important that any individual language that you might study today as a linguist, you must remember that it's evolved on the historical time frame, and each little piece of it is circulating in the community as a kind of meme, if you like, on the cultural level.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, that history and the time is important at the cultural level. But as a species, do we have certain advantage? I mean, I remember certain anatomists talking about, this evolution of vocal box, or the sound box.
Yeah.
Etc., that we can kind of produce these different sounds, and that's how we manage to get language started, etc. Is there any consensus on that?
Well, no, I wouldn't say there's any consensus. There's a lot of disagreement about whether, for example, vocalization is the key. Some people might say I think everyone would agree that vocalization is very important in the history of our species and in relation to language. We do have this extraordinary vocal anatomy. We have this extraordinary capacity for vocal imitation. Our abilities are unbelievable in imitating sounds through our vocal apparatus. So there's something clearly very special about the human vocal capacity. And the question is, historically, can we tell the timeline and which evolve, well, where were the pressures to evolve, so the argument might be, well, if you have language, if you have something like language that's culturally learned, and you're beginning to diversify vocabularies that are quite large in size, and you're beginning to innovate systems where you have what's called double articulation, which means that you have a phonological level where you have sounds, individual sounds, an inventory of individual sounds, and then you can combine them into syllables and build words out of those. Once you have a system, a generative system like that in place, then that might that could be quite simple, and then that might in turn put selective pressure on vocal imitation. So there's clearly a story there to be told about how the evolution of the human vocal apparatus is very tightly connected to language evolution. But one of the most important things that to always remember about language is that it's modality free. So there are many people in the world who are deaf, who don't have hearing, and they are able to use sign languages, which emerge when you have a concentration of deaf people within a community. Sign languages will emerge, and they won't use sound at all. It's just purely visual medium. So it's now very well established that these languages are fully functioning generative human languages in every sense, except the modality that they use, so that they don't use sound as the primary modality, they're visual. Of course, the language we're using right now doesn't only involve sound. You can see my body, so it's sound and vision combined. But that point, the reason why I'm referring to sign languages is to say that you could have evolutionary pressure on the vocal apparatus, but at the same time, you could have language as a modality-free functional system evolving, essentially as a kind of technology. And then you can, it's like a social conceptual technology, which you can then use any kind of hardware, in a sense, to implement.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So now going back to your book, Language versus Reality, where you actually talk about the use of language in different ways, and the major phrase is language is too blunt for scientists, but good for lawyers. And why is that?
Well, that's a kind of let's say, accessible way to kind of summarize the basic idea of the book. And it's sort of grounded. Something that I mentioned in the preface to the book is that for a good number of years, I worked at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands, and I worked with a very diverse group of people. So there were some who were kind of grounded in anthropology, and some in cognitive science, and some in sociology. And so we had a very diverse group of people looking at language, and there were some quite different research projects working in parallel. And one of those projects was looking at the semantics of language. So really looking at what kinds of meanings get encoded in words, and what kinds of meanings can be expressed through grammatical constructions. And so looking at, for example, perceptual domains like color and the structure of the human body, and how that's kind of labeled and things like that. And the consensus that was coming out of that work was that the world is very complex, and language is very, very, very much more simplified. If you want to label or describe the way the world is, you have to throw out an enormous amount of information from what you experience, right? So if you're just going to evaluate language on the basis of its capacity to describe or capture experience, you would have to say it's quite poor at that, right? So it's very low resolution, shall we say. And low fidelity as a means for recording things. So, you know, a good example would be something like describing colors or describing people's faces. You know, it's just very difficult to actually, just from the verbal description, kind of grasp exactly what the speaker kind of saw. So that was one whole line of work, was acknowledging that our experience of reality is many orders richer than what we can capture in the semantics of language. So that points to the idea that, you know, language is not a good tool for capturing the facts of reality if you're interested in you know, perceiving what's out there in the world. The other kind of big field of research that I was involved in that same group was looking at how language is used in social interaction. So what we do with language and how we organize our interactions using language as a device for that. And in that domain, you see that, you know, language is very high functioning, right? So language has this kind of it's very powerful for those functions that we were mentioning before in relation to animal communication, for influencing people's attention, for forging joint attention, for getting other people to commit to coordination in whatever the activity might be. You know, in things like storytelling, drawing people into your sort of circle and capturing their imagination, social bonding, all of these kinds of functions. Language is very good at those things. Obviously, it's not perfect, but the key, I think, from thinking about those two sides of language was to see that, as I put it in the subtitle of the book, language is good for lawyers. It's really designed for lawyers in the sense that lawyers is a kind of cartoon caricature of the lawyer, but the lawyer is somebody who has a position that they wish to defend, and they will use whatever means they can to sort of portray the situation in a way that is how they want it, in order to persuade or in order to influence the understanding of the others. And on the other hand, the scientist, you know, a good textbook scientist has no investment in the answer. They just want to know what the answer is. They want to know the truth. And that's not a very, you know, language is not very reliable for that, because it's full of all of these biases. It's full of all of this kind of, you know, cultural baggage. It's very general in its semantic structure. So, you know, you can't rely very well on language to represent reality. So therefore, it's not great for scientists. But even worse for scientists, it's inherently biased as a system. And so, you know, that those downsides for the cartoon scientist are upsides for the cartoon lawyer, who's like, yeah, great, this is a great system because I can choose words to, you know, take this single situation and I can take different words and describe them to either make my client look innocent or to make my client look guilty. And, you know, you can transplant that metaphor into sort of any field you want.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation, especially about the pain of scientists, that they always go through that. So the thing that you mentioned, at least in the book, the fact that there is this two-layer decrement in the world's complexity or in reality. So the world or reality in general is too complex. So first of all, we reduce it through our perception, and secondly, we reduce it through our language, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of important, because I find it a useful way to think about, you know, how we economize as kind of agents in the world. So, I mean, any sort of perceptual system is going to be evolved, and it's going to be evolved in such a way as to minimize costs and maximize survival, I suppose, or to be able to allow an organism to reproduce successfully. It should be, it should allow them to avoid death within the niche that they're in, but also above that level, not to create any further costs. So the world is too complex for us to be able to process all of it. We don't need to process all of it. And so, one of the things I just talk about in setting up early on in the book is pointing out that, just in terms of what we can perceive in the world, the kind of electromagnetic radiation that surrounds us, there's this massive spectrum, and we just can access this tiny little kind of part of it. And that's our perception. Now, when we think about that, we realize, okay, we're missing a lot of what's around us. We can invent tools that allow us to see that. We can get, infrared and different kinds of sensors and so on that allow us to hear things and see things that we normally can't hear or see. But the reason why we see and hear what we do see and hear is really about our relationship as individual agents to our environment, right? So we are tuned to our environment to a certain extent, given what our bodies are like and given, what our sort of evolutionary niche is like. And so it's a very much kind of tuned to the organism as a kind of an agent that has to move around within the world. And then there's this second level where we go from all of what we perceive. So now we've thrown away all the stuff we can't perceive. And as individuals, we have, this kind of much smaller spectrum of what we can perceive. But then within that, then you get another very, very compressed sort of step down into what we encode in language. So that band, just take color, the color spectrum, you have this massive, some estimates are like 1 million or more just noticeable differences in colors. That gets reduced in most languages to, a few terms or maybe a few dozen terms. And the question is, well, why do we get this second sort of massive step down in capturing kind of distinctions in the world? The reason I argue is that what language delivers is no longer about the relation between the agent and the world. It's about the relation between two agents. So you're using the language as a kind of a map or a pointer for people to coordinate around. So that's the kind of key. And oftentimes this gets collapsed when you look at the cognitive science of language, at least more traditionally. We're thinking about language as kind of mapping directly onto these kind of mental functions that, you have semantic categories because they help you think about your environment. And I want to argue that that's not what's important about language. Language isn't important for how it makes you think about the environment or allows you to think about the environment. It's important for how it allows you to coordinate with others around the environment in certain socially useful ways.
So in other words, language wasn't evolved to give us an ability to do science or study nature, etc. It was evolved just for this kind of social bonding, cohesion phenomena, right?
Well, yeah, that's my view. I think like people like Robin Dunbar, and I also think that many other kind of thinkers in the field of language evolution, believe that social interaction is a really important part of the story. I certainly agree with people like Dunbar or Mike Tomasello or many others that, that the foundation of language is social interactional and is based on, what some might call joint intentionality, which is, where two people share their attention or share their understanding of something in the world. Now, I would want to immediately say to your comment, this is crucial for science, right? So if you're talking about a scientist as, a single individual who's somehow trying to understand the world in front of them, I don't think that's really what science is, right? I mean, science is it obviously is wanting to understand reality. But if you're an individual agent in an environment, you're just trying to maybe make some predictions and not get hurt and, achieve whatever your local goals are. You're not necessarily desiring a kind of an explanation. And I think this is what's really crucial about language, is that once you have the capacity to use language to coordinate with others, and then you have a capacity to ask questions and ask things like why, then that is a prerequisite, I would say, to science in the sense that we usually mean it. And that is where you cooperate with others, you collaborate with others, you create joint systems of belief and common understanding, and then that leads to cumulative culture. And I would say, science is like a perfect example of cumulative culture, that you build and build and build over time, beyond, let's say, the immediate needs of your environment.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, there is no, I think no scientist would argue that science is a collective process, that we humans, that we come together and try to understand nature or study nature in more elaborative way. So there was another book which was published on reality. It's called The Case Against Reality by Donald Hoffman.
Right.
So I interviewed him, and he also has these two major points. First of all, evolution doesn't give us an ability to understand nature or reality, to see reality. It doesn't, I mean, the payoff there is the fitness, the we need to survive long enough to pass on our genes to the next generation, rather than be compatible to observe the reality. And the second thing, of course, then he goes on to another extent and explains the reality in beyond space-time, like that's like the consciousness part, what he tries to explain. So I don't know, what are your views on at least the on these 2 points? Did you come across his work?
Yeah, I did. I do cite it in my book, at least in passing, in the sense that I certainly agree with the essential idea that we are constructing reality in some kind of important sense. That is, we're projecting to ourselves some kind of useful theory of what is in front of us. And when I say useful, well, it's evolutionarily proven to be useful, and we don't need to sort of expend more energy on finding out anything more about the reality that's in front of us. I think that one thing that maybe, I'm not sure how much I emphasize this explicitly in the book, at least in that section, but there's something very important about the word reality, and that is that there are. I would follow the philosopher John Searle in saying that there are two distinct forms of reality. So one is what he would call brute reality, and that is the world of physical causes. And I think there's an interesting, that's where the discussion of Hoffman's discussion about saying, well, okay, you can split that as well and say, okay, well, there's the real world that we have no access to, and then there's our representation of it, which is what we work with. But I think that those are all kind of in the realm of physical reality and how we reason about cause and how we experience the world and so on. The second type of reality is social reality. And, I think, many who've looked at this point really emphasize that, there's nothing less real about social reality, but the way that it becomes real is very different. So a piece of social reality would be something like, if you have a license to drive in the state that you live in, either you do or you don't. So I have a driver's license in my state in Australia, in New South Wales. So it's a fact that I am licensed to drive. But that fact is not made true by atoms. It's not made true by causal processes that can be inspected in the piece of plastic that shows my license. That fact has come about through social coordination, through linguistic actions. So through people signing forms and through people passing laws and, these kinds of social agreements that make the conditions under which we can say it's true that I am licensed to drive. So that's another whole realm of reality that I don't think that Hoffman and company are really they're not really looking at that. But I think that in my conception of what you want to talk about when you talk about reality really must include that whole social reality kind of element. And what Searle argues is that you cannot have social reality without language. But all the rest of reality is it's not dependent on language in any way.
Yeah, this is interesting. So about brute reality, I mean, of course, the language does play a role there. First of all, we don't have, I think, good language itself, especially once we go at this quantum mechanics level, etc. And the same thing goes for the social reality, where again language plays an important role. So both of them, they are bound, at least with the tool that we call language.
Yeah, well, I would just say, I mean, they're affected by language in interesting ways. That I would just want to say that just because you can't describe something very easily or understand it very easily, it doesn't, mean that, language has no effect on it. It's not so much about the reality itself. It's really, you're talking more about our problems in accessing it or our problems in coordinating around it or whatever. But the reality just carries on, doesn't care about us in some sense. And that's kind of Searle's point about social reality, is that if you change what people believe or what people say, then you can change those realities as a direct result. But you can't really affect brute reality directly through saying things.
Yeah, so Yuval Harari, he talks about social reality, as you described in his book *Sapiens*, as imagined reality. That we kind of imagine stuff, for example, money, or as you mentioned about driving license, and it's just that we collectively agree on this thing and we kind of make it a reality. But it's like beyond human species. It's not like it really exists. So
yeah, I think that's almost right, but it sort of misses maybe something important. When you say imagined reality, it kind of individualizes the process, and it seems to suggest that you can create something just by imagining it. And I don't think that's right. I think that suggests some kind of magic. But just take something like money, right? So a piece of paper or a piece of metal has a certain value, and I don't think that we just imagine that. I do agree that it is, the value of money is maintained by human behavior. That's the kind of key. It's maintained by human agreement. And obviously, the value of money changes all the time, depending on people's behavior. The key thing is not the imagining. The key thing is the agreeing, right? It's the holding each other to account for having a common agreement. So when I talk about, going back to the example of being licensed to drive, I don't just imagine that I'm licensed to drive. It's really true that I'm licensed to drive. And if I am challenged on that point, I can back it up with evidence. I can show you my card with some language on it that certifies that I am licensed to drive. And you can trace back to these various kinds of speech acts. So it's actually, this is the one thing I would emphasize, is that it's more than just imagining. It's that all of these things like language, laws, norms, possession, ownership, all of these kinds of classic notions of social reality are truly backed up by these kind of what Searle would call declarations. And I guess to say one last kind of point is that ultimately, though, it all comes back to brute reality, because things like the value of money, ownership, whether you're licensed to drive or legally married, things like that, they are all ultimately legally, if you cannot agree, you ultimately go to the courts, and the courts, the last resort of the court is force, the brute reality, right? So, if you drive without a license, you will get fined. And if you don't pay your fine, you can be put in jail. So being put in jail, that's brute reality. You can't get out of your cell, right? It's you're physically contained. So, that's what's referred to as the state monopoly on force or monopoly on violence. And so it's just a kind of footnote, but I think it's important that ultimately social reality is underpinned by brute reality, because brute reality is that's the final the final resort of kings, as it's sometimes called.
Yeah, this is really interesting, the interplay between brute reality and social reality. Um, and since we are talking about that, let's also, so first of all, we can make a note here. Once we are talking about language here, it doesn't mean, it means all the languages that we have for humans, right? It's not like any
Yeah.
specific language or something. So we
Oh
are
yeah,
going.
well it does, but I should say though, I'm making general points about the power of language, but I'm not saying that. I would say that all languages have that sort of power, and it's just that the modality of the individual language, or the specific things that an individual language can do, they can be quite different. So you can take a language from one part of the world and compare it to a language from another part of the world. They will give you quite different categories. They will encode quite different concepts. So the social realities that they can create won't be the same. But all languages will give you ways to create that sort of social reality. So they'll give you ways, for example, to bestow a name upon a person. So my name is Nick. Different cultures have other ways of naming. You can have 2 names, 3 names, 5 names. There are all sorts of different, but things get named everywhere you go. And the name of a thing is a piece of social reality. In answer to your question, in languages, you have universal functions, like, for example, bestowing names or coming to agreements. But how those things are done will differ from language to language.
Yeah, but in the case of brute reality, all the languages can go down to kind of this human communication system rather than uh,
Well,
like.
of course, because all to actually operate, once you get down to the very sort of low level of operating the system, you're still bound to brute reality, because you have to have some perceptible signal. So if we're using spoken language, I have to be able to hear you. You're in another country. We have technology that creates a noise that can go into my eardrum, so we can hear each other because we have technology that manages brute reality in these kinds of ways. But if we didn't have this tech, you couldn't hear me because you're thousands of miles away. So we are always subject to the brute reality that's around us, purely because language is a semiotic system, and all semiotic systems must operate essentially based on perception is the kind of bottom level. Without having a possibility of perceiving some sign, nothing can follow from that. It's a prerequisite to any kind of communication happening at all. So if you go back to, I mentioned the Krebs and Dawkins work and the work on, animal communication systems, when you're manipulating another individual using communication, what you're doing is playing on their senses. You're touching, their senses. You're using their senses as a kind of tool. You're commandeering their sensory system, their brain through their sensory system. So it's always the brute reality is always limiting you through exactly that channel of perception, and then everything else kind of follows on from that.
Yeah, I think this is important because especially if we think of any future kind of silicon-based life or AI in even in that sense. So even if it'll be like more advanced, still it'll be kind of limited in its perception or receiving signal, just because the world is so complex. And I think these understanding that which comes from your work will be applied there as well. That still it'll be kind of limited to explain or to observe the brute reality, but also probably I don't know what will happen at the social level, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's worth noting that with language, a typical spoken language is very kind of cleverly designed. I mean, they're not designed, of course, but let's say evolved, cleverly evolved to use a very small number of perceptual distinctions. So if you look at, for example, vowel systems, so all spoken languages have vowels. And so they will have contrasts between sounds like a, I, u. And you will see that, most languages are going to have a pretty small number they're going to use a pretty small number of distinctions. So average vowel system in the world is going to have something like 5 distinctions or 4 distinctions or something like that. So something like, a, u, I, e. Okay, those 4 sounds. And so what's interesting is that, even though you've got this very, very fine potential perceptual set of perceptible distinctions in the vowel space, language just picks a very small subset of that. So it's very efficient, right? So in the brute reality of the kind of, auditory possibility space, language is very frugal, very economical. And it says, okay, I'm just going to see if I can take like 3 or 4. I'm going to cut this big space into just 4 pieces. And then I'm going to have a combinatoric system. Like I'm going to have syllables and I'm going to have some consonants. And then that's the brute reality part. The people I'm talking to, they've got ears, they can distinguish, these sounds. And then I get a combinatoric system where now I can start to generate words out of those things. So it's a very clever kind of digital system, ultimately, that heavily compresses the brute reality by using these kind of systems of categorization. So while what I was saying before is still true, that language depends on brute reality to be just carried as a science system, it's very cleverly kind of economical at how it does that.
And the other important thing is the complexity in the language. So there are some examples that you talk about in the book as well, where if 2 people, they are communicating about certain objects, they very quickly, they come up with a system which is fairly simple to point out at that system. And we do see that this kind of complexity in the languages, in human languages, right? So is there any way to understand if the complexity means, I don't know, better success in the language, or what it would help in a way to explain the reality or social, like brute reality or social reality, the complexity of the language?
Well, I would go back to kind of this distinction between the first level of sort of simplification of reality and the second level of simplification. So the first level is kind of the Hoffman kind of part, is, how much you can simplify reality for your perception is dependent on, what function do you put that perception to? So what functions do you need to perform? What goal are you trying to meet? Why do you need that information? Well, you need that information to avoid, tripping over, or, avoid hitting your head, or, you need to have balance. You need to see obstacles. So again, as an agent trying to get through a physical environment. But then the question of what you need in your language is not about that. It's about getting through coordination of a social environment. And for that, the question is, so when the question is, what's my function? You have to ask, well, what is socially required in the community that I live in? So what do I have to coordinate with other people around? So an example I think that I talk about in the book, at least in passing, is the kinship systems. So, all languages have ways of talking about kin relations. So words like brother and sister and son and daughter and father and mother and cousin and uncle and aunt and grandma and grandpa. These kinds of words are found in all languages, but there's great diversity in what they mean. So you look at a language like English, and if you just ask, well, how do I refer to the people who are the brothers and sisters of my parents, right? So in English, there's really just these two words, right? Aunt and uncle. And it doesn't matter if it's my dad's sister or my mum's sister, it's still my aunt. It doesn't matter if it's my dad's older sister or my dad's younger sister, it's still my aunt, right? And with those kind of two possibilities, mother's side, father's side, male sibling, female sibling, older, younger, you've got these 8 possible categories, and they are collapsed in English just into aunt and uncle. Whereas there's plenty of languages in the world where those distinctions are made separately. So I work on a language in Laos that have a separate word for each of those 8 people, okay? Mother's side, father's side, male sibling, female sibling, older, younger. So there's 8 totally separate words. So there's no general category for aunt, right? There are 4 different kinds of people that you have to refer to as aunt. So coming to your question, you would say then that system in this language is called Cree, spoken in Laos, that I work on, you would have to say that system is more complex, right? You have 8 categories. I have to remember 8 words. I have to track 8 different kind of distinctions. I have to know, is that person older or younger than I have to track more information. So there's a kind of cost, you might argue. And I reduce that cost, say, in the English system. But the argument is, well, you're not just reducing the cost, you're also losing the possibility of making finer distinctions. So I have to go to extra effort to say, well, that's my father's older sister, instead of just saying my aunt, right? So I have to go to extra trouble if it's an important piece of information. And the argument is that you will have the more complex system, like the Cree one, in a community where there is some cultural importance on making those distinctions. So for example, in the community that I'm talking about, there are different social obligations, for example, towards your nephew or niece, depending on whether you're older or younger than that person's parent. Okay, so I'm not going to get into all the kind of details of it here, but basically in let's say in the English-speaking world, you have an idea of what an aunt is like and what an uncle is like, and people conform to that idea to some degree, irrespective of which side they're on and so forth. But in another culture, actually, you need to distinguish, because there will be different obligations from those people, different expectations from those people, and it's the need to coordinate around those differences that requires you, or that gives you some payoff to paying that extra cost of maintaining a more complex system.
So is it good or bad, or it's conditional?
Well, good or bad, the only way to answer that question is to say, well, is that culture better or worse than this other culture? And, that's like kind of like it's a taboo question in some sense, but it's also like an impossible question most of the time. I mean, it opens up a whole lot of, sometimes opens up moral questions around cultural practices and so forth, but also a lot of the time it's pretty arbitrary, like, is it good or bad I eat rice versus pasta, which is it good or bad? No, neither of them are bad, they're just different, right? So I think it's like everything in a kind of complex system, there are trade-offs. And, you have these kind of, one of the points I talk about in the book is that, you can think about these trade-offs as a kind of a frontier where there's a trade-off between more complex on one dimension and less complex on the other dimension. And, there are some domains like this kinship one where it's argued that you have there's a kind of constant along which you can vary if you're just a kind of a regular human language. So I don't think you can say that better or worse, but you can. The reason is because if the evolutionary pressures are about arriving at a balanced trade-off, then there are different solutions to that problem that are equally good as trade-offs, right? But there are certain types of points in the possibility space that would be bad, right? So you would, for example, not have a language where you had to have a different word for every individual object in the universe. It just couldn't work, right? You have to generalize, you have to have categories. So you've got to, you have to lose information to some sort of extent. And then you also wouldn't have a language where you just have one word for everything. Because it gives you no capacity to differentiate, right? So there's always these extremes which would be impossible, and those would be bad systems. And I guess the point is we don't really see particularly bad systems precisely because they're adapted to human communication, and they're adapted to culturated societies that, where the language actually has a function, and that function is tested every single day through the transmission and the usage of the language.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, this when we are comparing the cultures and languages, there are all the different issues that you mentioned. But then there is another important question is like if this kind of language or the complexity of the language can affect psychology. So in reverse, once we think, means having this elaborative structure kind of give you a way to understand, I don't know, different things, can the social reality in a better way or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence that the structure of your language does affect psychology, and I review quite a lot of that work in the book, and there's a lot has been written about this. So there are many studies of what you might call linguistic determinism, and if you compare across languages, a kind of linguistic relativity where different languages will kind of direct your thought in different sorts of ways. Now, this is a somewhat controversial area. People like to disagree about how significant these effects are, but most people would agree that working with different categories in thought directs your attention in certain kinds of ways and leads to certain patterns of reasoning. So that's the first thing that people would agree on. So there's quite a lot of literature around, for example, linguistic framing, how situations get described actually leads you to reason differently about those situations. So that's a linguistic effect on reasoning, on cognition. So everyone, accepts that it's been demonstrated in various ways. And then what we also accept is that the thousands of languages in the world contain very different categories. So if you study the semantic categories of languages in the way we were just talking about, some languages elaborate certain domains, others treat them in very general terms. Some languages structure a concept in one way and other languages structure that concept in another way, or they don't have that concept. Or, essentially each language is a kind of factory of frames, right? That gives you all of these ways of thinking about the world around you, ways that are adaptive to your particular cultural kind of setting, right? I think it's just well established that those different framings, those different worldviews that are encoded through language will affect the way you think in certain kinds of ways. And coming back to your question about, what's good and what's bad, well, it's all really a matter of what context you find yourself in. So if you're working within the cultural context to which your language is adapted, then, it's generally going to be adapted by definition, right? But it's really when you're thinking in one language and operating within the kind of world of another language, that's one place where sometimes you get these kind of mismatches. But I think in general that the effects of language on reasoning are, they're real. They're not always highly consequential, but in a small percentage of cases, I think they can be.
Yeah, here we can also talk about this Sapira-Whorf hypothesis, which is again linked with the behavior and psychology and the language.
Yeah, that's right. So I did talk a bit about that hypothesis in the book. And it's interesting. I mean, in a way, I don't always kind of talk about it necessarily by name, because in the popular imagination, people have an allergic reaction to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is basically the idea that the language you speak affects the way you think in certain ways. And it gets kind of caricatured in certain ways. It gets described as, that language is, you're a prisoner of your language and your language forces you to think this and that. And it's basically like any of these domains that captures the imagination of the public, that as soon as it gets out into public discourse, it morphs into something not highly systematic and not directly related to its kind of origins. So I think it's really important when you're talking about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or the principles behind that, that you go back and look at the actual work that was done by the people who originated it. So in the book, I talk about Whorf and his work. And, the thing about Whorf is that he was just a very interesting thinker and somebody who was engaging with language and obviously had a real talent for it. But he wasn't doing systematic studies. He wasn't doing experiments. He wasn't doing comprehensive surveys of languages. He was just noticing really interesting stuff, and he had really interesting insights. And I think that some of the most famous critiques of that work, so one would be in Steven Pinker's book, The Language Instinct, where he sort of famously dismisses a Whorf hypothesis. It says it's completely wrong. It's not based on anything. Well, that's nearly 30 years ago, that book. And in the last 2 or 3 decades, pretty much since around the time that book came out, there's been an extraordinary amount of work in psychology, in linguistics, in neuroscience, that is really kind of looking much more systematically at possible ways in which the language you speak can affect the way you think. So I think now it's very well established there are a lot of different kinds of effects. I think what's sort of still open is how consequential are those effects and how much do they really kind of matter for what it means to be a speaker of a certain language, as opposed to merely being a human who has a certain cognitive system. So those considerations actually, I think they're important because they bring us back to something really fundamental about language, which is that all humans have it. So it's part of what it means to be human, is that you have language, you are a language using type of species, and that's unique to us. And yet, as a person, as an individual human, there's no one who has language in the abstract. You have a language, which is a culturally evolved system. And so that brings in this that's where human diversity comes in. So it's a great kind of, language is a great kind of overlapping point between human universality and human diversity. And of course, our species has cultural diversity, which is radical and quite unlike anything in the animal world.
And I think it's also important to think in terms of this co-evolution work. Like nowadays, a lot of people, they are studying the co-evolution of the species. So, of course, the interaction between different life forms which are around us, and also the sort of conditions which are there. So thinking in that terms, how culture evolves and what sort of conditions are there. One example that you also give in the book is the number of tree species reported in different languages. So the fact that because these things are or these things were important once those languages were being evolved. So of course, then we get different complexity, but also a different focus of the language. So the question here is, what is about, for example, there is something else which is human reasoning, rationality that we call. If that there is a connection there between kind of different languages, or it is common for all the humans.
Well, I think one thing that's really important about language is that it is inherently highly flexible system, right? So it's radically flexible. So you can, there's a lot of sort of constraints on language, but within those constraints, language is wonderfully flexible. So I mentioned before about, the vowels that a language can have. So some languages have like 3 vowels and some languages have, 20 vowels. It depends on how you count. And some languages have 10 consonants and some languages have 100. You have this amazing kind of diversity, and that's just the sound systems. You can go to the vocabulary of thousands and thousands of words and all of these domains, like the plant names that you mentioned. What that shows is that the system is evolved for flexibility. It's evolved for local adaptability, right? So you don't biologically inherit these languages. And the fact that in some cultures, the average person will know 500 names for tree species in their local area, and in another language, they might know 10. That's a great range, and it shows that language will. It's basically designed to adapt. It's designed to be flexible in that way. And that's exactly what culture is like. So one of the important kind of evolutionary arguments that invokes coevolution is the idea that, humans somehow were able to innovate this very important trick, culture, which was innovating not the content of the culture, not the content of the local knowledge, but the capacity to share and build upon local knowledge in this highly adaptable way. So, we famously have populated the entire earth, and we have people who live in ice environments and people who live in desert environments. And, we have these ways to adapt, and culture gives us that and is really bound up with that adaptability. And I think that's the important way to think about language in these terms is that it is inherently an adaptable system, a system that adapts to human needs.
Yeah. I mean, I remember talking to Desmond Morris, who talks about that just because humans spend a lot of time in their childhood, I mean, and with parents, that's how, or even with the community, that's how we end up kind of learn more and, inheriting also the culture part rather than just
Right.
the genetics.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And certainly very important in relation to language because, there is this cycle of transmission with language. So to know a human language, you must have spent years acquiring it. And to know it natively, those years must have been spent as an infant, as a small child, in a very intense, very sustained social life within a particular context, so a family and a village and some kind of small community. I mean, most humans don't really travel around and meet too many strangers until they've fully acquired their local language, and they've spent already kind of several years. So I think that's a really important point that Morris makes there. And it comes back to the point that I was making at the beginning about, how language is sustained by this really complex, adaptive set of really quite diverse systems. And so one of those systems is the population and the dynamics of our social networks. And so if childhood is a critical period for acquiring language and for acquiring cultural norms and for sort of, internalizing the kind of emotional norms of the place you live in, it's important that children are socialized in this very relatively closed kind of social situation. And of course, cultures vary in the degree to which a kid can go out of the household and so on. So it's not really about limiting a child to one family, but it's more about limiting a child to one, let's say, small village or small kind of extended area. And that's an example of the kind of social requirement that is causally related to account for why languages are the way they are. It's just it goes alongside these other more cognitive considerations that are equally important, but not at all the whole story.
So from the language point of view, if we will think the use of language, so what is it good for? That's first question. And then if on the basis of that question, we start thinking that, okay, which cultures are really good at employing language, just from the language point of view, to use it for the betterment of society in a way?
Right. I'd say language is good for what I say in the book at some length is that, language is good for social coordination. It's good as a tool for social coordination at all sorts of levels. So maybe at a very practical, immediate level, like getting someone to pass something to you, influencing people's behavior at a sort of very local level, but also equally good for coordination at a kind of higher social level. So through, for example, collective sense making, myth telling, storytelling that circulates, shared values that we have, gossip that circulates, shared sort of evaluations that we have about what's good and what's bad and who is part of our group and who is not part of our group. I mean, these are the things that language is good for. And I would say that those things, language is good for those purposes wherever you go in the world. That these are the things that people will use language for. They use it to get each other to do things for them. They use it to forge social relations and to manipulate social relations. So all of those, the very high level kind of functions, no matter where you go, language will be good for that. What else it will be good for, that's a more local question. When I say, oh, it's good for coordinating social activities, and then your question should be, but what are these social activities? And the answer is, well, you have to go and look at the environment that you're in. So if I am in if I'm a mechanic and I work in an auto shop and I spend the day fixing cars, I need a vocabulary so that I can talk to my fellow workshop workers when I say, well, I need this, I need a spark plug, or, pass me a carburetor, or, Phillips head screwdriver. I need all this terminology that comes with my language that allows me to coordinate around categories and objects that are highly specific to my cultural setting, so the kind of technological context. So, every culture will have specializations. It will have knowledge that's specific to certain groups, and the language will be adapted to kind of suit that. Now, you're kind of asking, well, could you sort of look for a culture that was, would provide some kind of advantage, general advantage in some sense, or a language rather, that would, we should all learn that language and speak it. I don't think that you can say that there would be such a language, because there's always the question of, but what would you need that language for? What context is the same everywhere in the world? There isn't. So you're always in a different cultural setting. You're always in a different ecological setting. You're always in a different matrix of kind of cultural assumptions. And once you know those things, then your best bet would be to speak the language that the people around you are speaking, right? Because the languages are they're not tuned to some kind of absolute set of functions. They're tuned to the local functions that people use them for in whatever that locality is. So I would resist this kind of view that one language or another language is kind of better in some absolute sense, because the question is always going to be there, better for what? So you hear sometimes people saying, this language is better because it's more logical, or this language is better because it's more, intuitive. I don't know how you would measure those things, firstly, but secondly, I just think that the question that always comes to my mind is, for what? If it's functional, it has to be functional for some purpose, for some community, and there is no generic purpose and there is no generic community for language.
Okay, this is, I think, really important, because especially once we start thinking about human progress beyond language. I mean, we have made some absolute changes in a way, like we can talk about human rights or animal rights that people are fighting for nowadays, right?
Yeah.
Which are beyond imagination, and I think it's also kind of beyond language if we go there, and that goes to certain extent about human rationality, human reasoning part, that whether it's limited to certain language or it is just a kind of human phenomena of social coordination, as you mentioned, that just because we coordinate, we kind of discuss with each other, we can reach to certain conclusions, which are, even if we don't have good language for, or good words that can describe that phenomena, but still we can reach to certain conclusions which are beyond our vocabulary or our explanation at that time. So
Yeah. Oh,
what are your
absolutely.
thoughts on the rationality and reasoning part of humans?
Well, I mean, I guess there's a few things. One thing I want to say is that, with progress and with kind of innovation, the flexibility of language that I mentioned is always there. And so you can come up with a new idea, you can try to promote a new concept, and you can just make new language. Language is being innovated all the time. Our language is changing just right in front of us all through our lives. So there's no sense in which you're kind of imprisoned or limited by your language, because we can just create new kind of conventions. And so it's very dynamic in that way, and again, very adaptable. I think, you've asked a couple of times about rationality, and I think it's a great question, and it's something really worth kind of talking about. I have been thinking more and more about this topic, and I think about it from the point of view of Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. You might have encountered their book, The Enigma of Reason, in which they make the case that, human rationality is really, I don't know, like an appropriation or an exaptation from something that is really evolved not for arriving at new knowledge, but for persuading others. So it's really kind of parallel to the argument I've been making for language, but it's specifically about thought. And my view actually is that language is more important, I think, in that argument than perhaps Mercier and Sperber say. I think they understand very well the power of language. But what I would want to emphasize is that if rationality is fundamentally about a system for justifying or arguing or persuading others, then all of those things like justifying, arguing, persuading, those are speech acts. Those are communicative acts, and they're not mental acts. I mean, they involve mental acts, but they're primarily communicative acts. So, essentially, if you think of rationality as being kind of somehow based on language, then the way to think about it is that you start with a system for influencing others. You start with a system for, getting others to think new things, getting others to act in certain kinds of ways. And then, with a semantic system, you get others to come to new beliefs. All of these things are using information to kind of manipulate others' mental states for some benefit. And then eventually you see that, that can be used, that system for interpersonal influence can be used to arrive at new knowledge, right? And that's how, we can use that in a new way for kind of rational, as what we would now today call kind of rational thought, is really more about taking a socially evolved system and redirecting it towards the kind of purpose of trying to arrive at new knowledge. And I think, this is something that I've begun to think more and more about it, particularly in light of the concept of rational thought put forward by people like Karl Popper. So what I think is so important about Popper's work on how do you arrive at knowledge, he argued for what he called a clash of cultures, that, it's very important when you're trying to advance in your knowledge that you make yourself open to relentless critique, that you subject yourself to relentless critique. You put forward your ideas in a creative way and you allow yourself to be critiqued. And so this idea of critique is, again, another kind of speech act, right? It's another kind of communicative exchange where you really require another person to use language to talk about what you've said. So this comes us back to our reflexive function of language, that language allows you to talk about the communication system itself, which means I can take what you said and evaluate it. You made a statement, I can say, no, that's wrong, or why do you think that, or whatever the case is. You're taking a system for persuasion and turning it into a system, or using it as a system for generating knowledge. And so to my mind, that's how I would want to see the fundamental connection between language and rationality.
Yeah, this question is interesting because like your subtitle as it goes, that it's language is good for lawyers, but not for scientists. Because once we think of this rational view, even from the lawyer's point of view, because that's what the evidence points at, that, okay, this criminal is not like really criminal, right? So that would seems like a rational view, but even if that person is a murderer, right? But thinking from science point of view, it'll be something different, that, okay, maybe this theory that it works at at this point, but maybe it is rational or not rational. Like it'll depend on how we account for evidence, I guess.
Yeah. And so I think it's always important to acknowledge that in these kind of scenarios, like, a person has committed a crime, you're trying to figure out who it was. You are always balancing simultaneously the needs of a scientist and a lawyer, right? So that it's not like there's 100% scientist over here and 100% lawyer over there. That, all of us have some element of both of those sides in us at the same time. So, a scientist wants to arrive at the truth, but they should be trying to persuade others. They should be, on this model, this Popper model of kind of self-critique, you need to have a spirited defense and a spirited attack, for the longer term purpose of arriving at the truth, right? So, that's one point. I think another point is that there's an ethical dimension to this, right? So, if you are in a court of law and someone has committed a crime, I mean, let's just leave the kind of monetary. I mean, the problem with talking about lawyers in this kind of cartoonish way is that, lawyers are they're paid by their clients, right? Now, if you just think maybe from the point of view of the judge, okay, so the judge is not supposed to have any predisposition to want to see that this person is put in jail or set free, right? They just want to know what is true, what happened. And there, so there'll be two lawyers, one on one side, one on the other, trying to kind of convince them as hard as they can. So from that, when you think about the judge as being sort of in the middle, then of course the ethical dimension comes in. And that's where, in a system like a court of law with a judge, you've decided that to place a kind of an ethical importance on truth, that we actually do want to know what the truth is, and it does matter. And we know if this person committed the crime, we want them to be punished, and if they didn't, they don't want them to be. So that system puts a certain ethical weight on the facts. And, I think that science is like that. And we know that culturally that's not always the case. So, I'm thinking of studies, for example, where, if you look at legal arguments in different cultures, if I damage your property completely accidentally, right, not through any, or even, I don't know, let's say like a pig escapes from my farm and goes to your farm and eats your carrots or something like that, right? I would be probably liable for damages in some sense, but it would be different from if I had gone over and actually dug up your carrots. So maybe it's not the best example, but there are different cultural kind of norms around how I would decide on your culpability and how I would treat that. In some kind of cultural settings, like I think a certain legalistic settings and scientific settings, the facts of the matter, the kind of the truth is in the foreground, and that's the thing that we're supposed to kind of get at. And I don't think that's necessarily always the case. And I think as long as rationality puts that in the foreground, then then things will go in the right direction. But you will still need to have persuasion in interaction with some kind of evidence-based representation of what is true.
Yeah, these arguments, I think they are really, they would make sense, especially to fight, for example, misinformation that we are seeing nowadays. And of course, there are reports that, okay, it's increasing, this and that. But I mean, at the end, if humanity is all about persuading the other humans, then maybe we have, I think, we'll have to, I think, narrow down the problem in a better way. Like, the persuasion has to be kind of based on certain evidence and truth, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we go back to the Mercier and Sperber kind of argument, in certain settings, the persuasion is all that matters, right? I mean, oftentimes it doesn't matter what was true. If I just get you to believe what I'm saying to you, then I've succeeded. And sort of evolutionarily, that's kind of part of their argument, is to say, well, if the real function of persuasion is just to get other people to join your side in some sense, then truth doesn't necessarily provide a kind of an evolutionary pressure. What's really important is, did it convince other people to adopt your point of view, right? So that's the danger, is the slippage between the power of language and reasoning as a speech, as a communicative act to bring others into line with you. That's a slippage between that and getting them to actually believe true things. And it's clearly the best world is where you can align both of those things, right? If I'm the best persuader, but I also have the truth, that's the best. Maybe I'm the best persuader, but I don't have the truth. And of course, that's the problem at the moment with things like our current media landscape and the fact that the best persuaders do not have our interests at heart, and they are motivated by their business models. And we understand quite well the problem at the moment is basically a misalignment between the incentive to persuade and the incentive to represent the truth.
And the interesting element there would be confirmation bias, means I want to believe the other person, even if the persuader doesn't have the truth, etc. So
absolutely. So yeah, it feels good, and I think so. Actually, again, to cite Hugo Mercier, he has his wonderful book called Not Born Yesterday, and he talks about the idea of a market for they talk about a market of ideas, right? Where you go out into the world and ideas come around, and you shop around and you pick the best ones, and everyone becomes smarter. That's the theory. And Mercier says, no, it's not a market of ideas, it's a market for justifications, or a market for rationalizations of the ideas that I already hold. And when I introspect my own kind of media consumption behavior, I see exactly the same thing. I like it when I find something that confirms what I already think, right? It's very hard to kind of counter that. It takes work. And so I certainly agree that things like confirmation bias, I mean, those play an important role in the argument around whether rationalization is fundamentally designed for influencing others in communicative acts versus arriving at new knowledge in mental processes.
Yeah, and do we have any, or like, can we learn from different languages about fighting these kind of phenomena? So, for example, if we think that language is this kind of dynamic process, should we care if the languages, they are going extinct in a way that they are dying, as you mentioned also in other conversations?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an interesting kind of jump that you make there. First thing I would say would be that I think all language communities have these problems. I mean, language, one of the most important things about language is that you can use it to lie, and you can use it to cheat people, and you can use it to gossip. And, it's a very susceptible everywhere you go to exactly this dynamic. So I don't think that there would be any kind of language where lying and misrepresenting or persuading, is not part of life. But the question is, do you see some variance there? And this is not something that we have very good data about. So we have a lot of data on languages of the world about things like, what is the sound system like, and what is the grammatical structures like? And, we have some good basic data for hundreds and hundreds of languages, but data about things like this is actually very hard to get. So you're asking questions about norms around truth, norms around making assertions. But having said that, there certainly is a sense particularly in the literature by anthropologists, that there are quite different norms from culture to culture around to what degree we assume that other people, have access to the truth. So maybe I'll give you an example that's just come to mind. So this is not really part of the matter of kind of cultural values around information, but there are systems in the world's languages where they're called evidentiality systems. I'm not sure if you've heard this term, but in English, I have to mark on verbs if the event took place in the past. So we have past tense, so walk and walked. So I have the ed suffix there. So my language requires me to mark this kind of tense difference, right? Now there are languages that require you to mark something different, which is called evidentiality, and it's a marking of whether, let's say I tell you an event, right? So John's house burnt down, right? And the language requires me to put a suffix on that verb to say, I saw it with my own eyes, or I heard about it from people who told me, or I inferred it from some evidence. So I saw some smoke, but I didn't actually see the house. So this is not a rare system, and quite a lot of languages have some kind of marking which requires you to put on record your source of the information that you're giving, right? So that kind of system might be something that kind of responds a bit to your question and says, okay, well, this is a kind of good system in relation to truth because it requires you to kind of go on record with your your evidence and so on. But to be honest, in reality, I personally think that there's a kind of an overemphasis on the fact that those are grammatically obligatory forms, and because if you have a language like English, it's true that we don't have to mark those things like we have to mark tense, but we mark them all the time voluntarily. So I will use words like apparently, or it seems that, all of these kinds of bits of language that will very subtly kind of package the information that I'm giving you. So the reason why I'm saying all this is to say that that languages will give you a lot of resources for packaging information in terms of, how committed you are to the truth of it, what's your source of that information. And I suppose what you could study, which we don't have enough information on, is how much of the time people actually mark these things in different languages and what are the consequences of it. So we see these studies of evidentiality systems, but it's very hard to get data which shows that I'm actually accountable. So let's say it turns out I say John's house burnt down and I put a suffix on that verb that says that I saw it with my own eyes. And later it turns out I didn't see it with my own eyes. Someone told me about it. Would I actually get held accountable for having used the wrong suffix? Maybe, maybe not. But it's just like if I tell a lie in a language, sometimes I get caught, sometimes I don't. And all languages allow that to happen. So, yeah, that's the best I can do in answer to your question. But I think it's a great question, and it's something that is really open for study.
Yeah, so when we are thinking of different languages, let's talk about a language which is good for science, mathematics. So from a linguistic point of view, first of all, what do you think? Mathematics is a language or not? Like, does it qualify as a language?
Well, I wouldn't say mathematics is a language, but I would say that it's linguistic. It's a kind of weird answer, but I have thought a little bit about this, and I think that there's obviously a lot of discussion about what is mathematics. Is it sort of this set of truths that exist independent of us, or is it some kind of description of the world that's kind of invented by us? But I think it has a lot of things in common with language. So it has a kind of so it has some important things in common with language. It includes, for example, statements, right? So you make statements. Here's a statement, and here's another one that would follow from that, and here's another one that would follow from that. So in a sense that you have these statements and these narratives that kind of get built up, and certain things follow from certain other things. you have kind of grammatical structure in some sense. So a simple, some very simple equation, like 2 + 2 = 4. You have, in some sense, like a kind of subject and a predicate. So, you're talking about something and then you're giving some kind of characterization of that thing. So I actually think that, mathematics as it's used by people, is very much linguistic in its character and how it functions. I wouldn't say it's a language in the same way that, say, English is a language, but I think it's a good case of a language that, has really intentionally stripped away a lot of the vagueness and the ambiguity. I know, of course, mathematical symbols are highly ambiguous, just like any language. But you make sure in the way that you use them that people aren't confused about what you're talking about. So it is a kind of language. I think it's impossible without language. And I think that it has the characteristics of a highly specialized kind of vocabulary, of course, with special operations, so syntactic operations and so on. But I'm not sure if it's really all that different to, at least in terms of the vocabulary, to, let's say, the highly specific language of auto mechanics, right? You have to be specialized. You have to learn a whole cultural set of norms and knowledge, and then you're able to get entry into using that communicative system for coordinating with others in the same community.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think because I mean, science has been using mathematics, and so far it is like quite successful in terms of helping science, doing all the predictions. So in that sense, yeah, like it really, and of course, I mean, once you ask these questions, even mathematicians, they are a bit here and there to really reply to that, like what is it, like how we actually use mathematics to accurately describe, in your words, brute reality, right?
Yeah. I think something else I would kind of mention about maths that I think is really close to language is, well, two things. I mean, one is the flexibility of the system for local functions, and the other is the capacity of the system to refer to itself. And these are really powerful elements of language. So I'm just thinking of very simple mathematical operation, like saying, let X be this, right? And, that's like saying, we're going to call this a mug, right? And we don't have a moment, when I learn English as a kid, well, everyone calls it a mug, and I learn, well, that's what we call a mug. But the basic operation is the same, where you agree, let's agree to call this, and then we don't have to negotiate every time we have that reference, right? And in the course of describing some mathematical equation or something, you may actually hear these kinds of speech acts. We're going to let this equal that. And it's a real-time kind of example of this, of using language as a kind of coordination device, but also in this highly flexible way as a way of adapting functionally to what the local coordinative needs are.
Yeah, the only thing is probably someone should publish a book on like poetry of mathematics or something.
I'm sure there's more than one book on that. Yeah.
If someone can capture the the depth of emotions and kind of humanness that we have in mathematics, that'll be like really, really great. So thank you so much for the great conversation. I think we've covered a lot about language, missed out on some topics about emotions, etc. But then maybe we can do it in the future.
I'm really sorry you dropped out. You said missed out, and then I didn't hear you.
Yeah, so I was saying that we kind of missed out on few topics about, but actually again there can be many topics, but maybe that those topics we can cover in the future sometime. But yeah, thank you for actually putting language in this broader perspective. It'll really help, I think, the listeners to put science in this broader perspective, and also think language, how much it can help to describe science or reality, but also where it lacks. So thank you so
Yeah. Well,
much for
thank
that.
you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.